As they descend a rock-carved staircase on their way to the entrance of an ancient underwater tomb, archaeologists Kristin, Romy, and Pierce Paul Creaseman are sweating through their dive masks. Mainly, they didn't know what they planned to find. When archaeologists enter a flooded tomb, they discover something remarkable. Both Pierce Paul Creaseman and Kristin Romy have degrees in underwater archaeology. So when Romy knew about craftsman's fantastic to investigate a lowered old burial chamber in Sudan, she chose to call him and tag along. What would they discover? Quite possibly, they were past the point of no return, and grave looters had previously beaten them to the fortunes concealed profound inside the antiquated burial places. It froze over her head in the distance of a pyramid in the north of Sudan, as Romy prepared to dive into the very yellow sandstone-filled water. This was a huge clue as to why she was going through all of this. The pyramid was home to a held ruler influence over a greater part of northern Africa. While Romy and Creasman were on the lookout for something else entirely, they were not focusing on the monument. What they found at the lower part of the overflowed pyramid is really shocking. Romy and Creasman weren't just having fun by diving into the questionable water. They had an objective at the top of the priority list: a man's burial chamber. For a prepared archaeologist like Romy, that piece of history merited plunging into the overwhelmed underside of the pyramid. She gradually advanced down the stone-cut flight of stairs into the water. She only had a tube to the surface and a small canister strapped to her back for emergency breathing. Would the old burial place merit the absence of oxygen? Creasman hung tight for Romeo at the lower part of the old flight of stairs. That implied that the two must ensure they clutched their oxygen tubes and ideally not need to utilize their crisis canister of air. Yet, when you're under an old pyramid going to investigate a long failed to remember burial chamber, what happens next is anyone's guess. Half a month preceding this endeavor, Creasman had investigated the burial chamber of Masterson without anyone else, in order to investigate the submerged sarcophagus that had remained untouched for centuries. The two of them were going to descend into the three chambers together at this point. The burial chamber that two archaeologists were investigating is situated in Nuwari. Nuwari is likewise near the east of the Nile stream, so the pyramids are inclined to flooding. The pharaoh's tomb's three chambers are submerged in water as a result. The line of 20 pyramids denotes the graveyard of the Kushite royals, the dark pharaohs who worked as vassals on the southern edges of the Egyptian realm. The pharaohs revived some of the religious practices of the ancient Egyptian empire by constructing grand structures along the Nile River during their reign. One such practice was building pyramids to cover their lords underneath. The pyramids of Nuwari remained generally neglected from the beginning of time. There was no safe way for archaeologists to explore the tomb's underbelly because underwater archaeology had not been attempted in Sudan. The primary individual to have a go at breaking the entombment chambers was George Reisner, an American classicist who had practical experience in Old Egypt and its covered history. Reisner was effectively ready to investigate burial chambers inside the pyramids of Giza, which housed old royals. At Nuwari, however, all he found was that the pharaohs were submerged and that their tombs had been flooded. From 335 BCE to 315 BC, this particular pharaoh ruled as one of the minor royals. His pyramid is situated on the worst piece of land because he was the last king to be buried in Nuwari. Therefore, diving into his tomb was the only option available to anyone who desired to learn more about his past. Albeit that is not exactly simple or easy, as the water level has risen decisively since the hour of Reisner. His endeavor, basically his laborers had the option to track down the flight of stairs that drove down into the burial chamber. Unfortunately, that was the only thing the worker had time for, and as soon as he came back to life, Reisner and his team left, leaving the tomb undisturbed and the staircase covered in sand from the desert. It was only after years some other time when Creasman dared to Nuwari that the flight of stairs was uncovered indeed. Unfortunately, it took Creasman and his group about a year to uncover it. Quick forward another year to 2019, and he was at long last ready to wander down to the burial place's section point. While the flight of stairs allegedly has 65 steps, the scientists were simply ready to recover 40. Proceeding stirring things up around town of the water, Creasman added, "We realized we wouldn't have the option to go any further without putting our heads under. Divers who entered the chambers ran the risk of becoming trapped if the surrounding rocks fell into the opening, which posed an additional threat below the water." Creasman used metal chutes to reinforce the entrance to the chambers because no one wanted to be trapped underground. Presently, the issue was that to enter the burial chamber, the jumpers must shimmy around the chute. Each fearless person who needed to investigate the opposite side of the flight of stairs was going in essentially blind in light of the sandstone-filled water. They had to pass through a line that brought oxygen from the surface, making it even more difficult than getting through the chute on their own. When the planned operations were all settled up, the specialists were at last ready to make a plunge and research frightful people burial chamber. The sandstone and water combination is horrendous for perceivability in the transport estimated chamber. However, Creasman and Romy surrounded around prior to arising in the subsequent chamber. It's likewise here that Creasman started to unload a few supplies, putting electric lamps and plastic jerry containers to enlighten the dull chamber. They then proceeded to the final room. The archaeologists entered the third and last chamber. Underneath them, albeit barely noticeable, was a stone coffin where they assume it survives from frightfulness throughout everyday life. As this is the earliest phase of a tremendous venture, Creasman needs to ensure everything is set up and that they have a strong strategy moving into 2020. They had recently revealed an enormous unaccounted for piece of money history. He wanted to show that the air supply system he had in place could actually be used for a long time safely. Additionally, he needed to take essential estimations of every one of the chambers. The last move toward the fundamental arrangement of investigating the burial place was to completely dig through Riser's pit to check whether anything was disregarded or abandoned. The Creasman was going to discover the reason why one of the workers was digging through that very spot, but the opening of the stone coffin would have to wait until a later time. They originally needed to sort out some way to get the stone casket out of the chamber and to the surface before pondering opening the top. This implies that the vast majority of what Masterson was covered with is still in the burial place, regardless of whether a few items have crumbled, and are presently essential for the sandstone and water blend. The group proceeded to uncover a greater amount of Riser's pit, finishing plastic containers with silt and swinning them up very high pocket and second chamber. Then they continued to put the dregs on his screen and filter for ancient rarities, and kid did they discover a few intriguing things. The material probably once covered figurines that have since vanished into the water. Their claim that the rising water had deterred grave thieves is further supported by the fact that the gilded figures would have been easy prey for grave thieves. They talked about the impending year and the objectives they had for the venture. The most important was bringing the 2,300-year-old underwater sarcophagus to the surface in some way. Creasman is optimistic, asserting that "I believe we have finally acquired the technology necessary to tell Murray's story and fill in the details of what transpired here. This is a tale that ought to be told." Thanks for watching.